Alrighty, now we're going to talk about something a little bit different, and that's about, basically if you ever find yourself in the very unfortunate scenario of finding it so hard to meet your home loan repayment, so you actually just want to give up the home entirely. And rather than having to go through the process of selling, which can take quite some time, you're very keen to just surrender the home to your lender. Now, this is something that happens a bit in the US, where some people do just leave the keys in the letterbox and get out of there, see you later. But in Australia, it's a little bit different. We're wondering if perhaps it is still possible, though. And someone who's written a piece about this is Denise Raward, our financial journalist, who's written this for our sister site, Your Mortgage. G'day, Denise. Thanks for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar.
Nice to be here.
Good to have you back, Denise. But before we get into this very interesting topic, do you have a savings tip for us?
I do have a savings tip. I just thought of it this morning at precisely 4:10 a.m. when I had to drop a young girl who's backpacking around Australia at the bus to get to the airport. She was going to catch an Uber to the airport that would roughly come in at about, $35. And I said to her, we're in Queensland where I am, and you can get a 50-cent bus to the airport. So I dropped her off for the first bus of the morning at 4:10 and thought, how good is public transport? So that's my tip, particularly if you live in Queensland where everything's 50 cents.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's an interesting one because I didn't know that buses, because I thought for some reason transport to the airport was different, because I know the air train that we have in Brisbane and the Gold Coast doesn't get the 50-cent treatment. It is still the $20 or whatever.
Yeah, it's still $22. It's crazy.
Yeah, for whatever reason that's not covered under it. But yeah, buses, I hadn't actually thought about that. Get a bus to the airport, maybe you'd be exempt. So yeah, that's a good tip I hadn't considered before, Denise. But yeah, getting onto this meaty topic here. I guess just first up, is it even possible to voluntarily surrender your home in Australia?
Well, it's interesting. When I started researching the article, it was very hard to find information about it. As you mentioned in the intro, yes, it is a little bit more common in the US, or it was. It was in the GFC. It became a thing, and had a little colloquial term there called jingle mail. And basically, jingle mail is when you put your keys in an envelope and mail it back to your lender. And that became a little bit more the done thing when you were in a state that had non-recourse home loans. And it's not all US states that allow those home loans. I think it's about 11 or 12 states that do. It means that you can just surrender on your home and your home loan, and your lender can't come and chase you for any other money that you owe. Even then, it's not that common in the US these days, and not that common in Australia either. So what I found out when I, searched around some legal minds, people who'd been practicing law for a long time had never had to actually do it themselves.
Yeah, it's a pretty involved process, I think, in Australia. And we've seen The Big Short, the movie with Steve Carell in it by now, and Ryan Gosling as well. And some of us may have even read the book as well. And there were scenes of strippers somehow owning 5 homes in Florida, and they can't afford it, so they just put the keys in and drive away, and that's it. The debt doesn't really chase them, whereas in Australia it's a little bit different. But what happens when people in Australia are struggling to repay their home loan, and they've gone through the sort of, maybe they're past due, 90 days due, they're technically in default? What happens there if they just can't be bothered anymore and they just want to give the home back to the lender? What's the process there?
Well, a lot of the lawyers that I spoke to, it was the first time they'd sort of considered the process of surrendering your home. So, basically a lot of them said to me that banks are not really that interested in repossessing homes, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it's bad for their reputation to be seen to do that. And we should really point out, this is a bit of a last resort thing. There's a lot of hardship provisions that lenders can make to borrowers before you get to this stage. Generally, though, they're temporary, and they're designed to get you through a rough patch. And, most of the people I spoke to suggested that it was a much better idea for borrowers themselves to sell their homes. As we know, banks, they don't like having those sort of encumbrances on their books and can be quite keen to just sort of offload them as soon as possible. And that means you may not get the best price that you're after should you do it that way. So I think the main message is, if you feel that your temporary hardship measure is not going to, be a long-term solution, option number one is to sell your home yourself. But there's a lot of reasons that people may not choose to do that. And, you should speak to your lender if you just want to sort of subvert the process of them having to formally repossess it. There's still some legal proceedings that need to be done for you to hand your home over.
Thankfully, it sounds like this is a very rare phenomenon in Australia, because I can't even imagine the circumstances you'd have to be in where this is what you're thinking is your only option. But do you have any insights into that? Like, why would someone really want to go down this route instead of trying to sell the home? I mean, of course, we mentioned selling a home can take a bit of time and there's agent fees involved, but are there any other particulars there that could drive someone into this?
It's probably people who are not that well, and that can be mental health as well as physical health. And so that might be a time where someone, it is just really too hard for that person to do it. And a lot of the lawyers that I spoke to said, in this situation, it will really depend on individual lenders as to how they would approach something like this. Sometimes an individual lender might hook them up with a real estate agent, or perhaps suggest there may be a third party out there that can sort of facilitate the sale, rather than going through the repossession process, which is a formal court proceeding. In Australia, you as the title holder of your home are the owner of it, officially the owner, but on your title there will be your mortgage. And that's where people who lend you money they do have to go through legal proceedings to be able to take that back off you, what we call repossess, and put that on the market. So it can subvert that process. If you say, look, this may save some money, as one of the lawyers that I spoke to for the article said, it can take a lot of the antagonism out, and it can also be more timely because, while your home is waiting to go through that process and you may be unable to make your repayments for that time, that's still money that you will owe your bank at the end of the process. So this may be a way of just giving you a little bit more control back over the time and how much that blows out what you owe at the end. Of course, you're always going to owe that money at the end. It just may be better if you can do the sale yourself, of course, or at least hand your home over so that it can be more quickly done by someone else on your behalf.
Yeah, for sure. And I dare say mental health would probably be a big factor in this. For a humorous take on it, you can watch Peep Show, the episode Sectioning, where Mary hands over the pub to Super Hands and Jeremy. She's very mentally ill, and they call it the Swan and the Pedo. So, but away from that, let's talk about some facts and figures of mortgage hardship in Australia. What are the most recent stats telling us, Denise?
Well, I did have a look at some stats this morning. I think I looked at 2023, which was the year that we mainly saw that big run of escalating hikes to the cash rate. There was something in that year, I think 177,000 hardship notices, and that was among the top 30 lenders in Australia. Now, not all of those were to do with home loans. For home loans, it was something like, off the top of my head, about 119 home loan accounts were affected, and about 80% of those were owner-occupiers. So, by the time, that is really people losing their home as opposed to their investment properties. So, it was a period where we did see a lot of, reliance on hardship teams. But in that same period, we really didn't see that many homes being repossessed and sent for sale. So when you compare those two figures of hardship notices issued and repossessed homes being put on the market, it is fairly minuscule. So we can see that lenders, do try to perhaps uphold their end of the bargain. or the alternative is people are selling their homes themselves. And yeah, there's ways to do this in Australia. All of the lawyers that I spoke to suggested if you're thinking of doing this or it seems to be your only option, you would probably still need some legal help to make sure that you're not being ripped off by the bank. And the article that I wrote for Your Mortgage, I also supply some free legal advice and financial advice services. Because obviously, if you're behind on your home loan repayments, you're probably thinking that you can't afford to go to a lawyer. But there's always services out there that can help you with that, which is something else we should keep in mind.
Yeah, it certainly seems like post-COVID, there's a lot more support for borrowers that are struggling at the moment with their mortgage. Because I don't think we've seen arrears or default rates pick up to where it was before COVID, and we were expecting it to sharply increase. With remember that whole I can't even remember what the analogy was, the cliff or something, the tsunami of fixed rates,
Fixed rate
mortgages
clear.
reverting to variable rates. And we thought, a lot of people thought there were going to be just a flurry of homes for sale suddenly, basically like forced sales, so that because people couldn't afford, the suddenly much higher repayments. But that just hasn't materialized. And, I wonder if a lot of it is to do with lenders offering things like repayment holidays now. It just seems like lenders really don't want to go through the process of dealing with a default and a repossession. Why do you think that's the case, Denise?
Yes, and a lot of lawyers said, that is really the last resort for banks. They really do want you to stay with them as a customer, and with the best case scenario, paying your home loan repayments. So yeah, they're very reluctant to go down that path themselves. So that's a good thing to know if you're in a bit of difficulty, is that it's hardly going to be their first option, and really they would prefer not to do it, for their reputation, and also because it's a hassle for them. There's a lot of court processes involved in that. It takes a lot of time. There's some legal cost, which ultimately is borne by the borrower at the end of the whole process. So, to surrender your home sort of can take a bit of the cost out of it, perhaps. And also give you a bit more control over when you leave the home. These things can be negotiated if you surrender your home, as opposed to going through that repossession process where, the worst case scenario is a sheriff comes along and removes you physically from your home. So yeah, that's not a good look. And that's why a lot of lenders, don't do that as their first option. So I think we've got to remember that this isn't a popular course, especially as you say, Dom. In light of the COVID pandemic, I think there was a lot of flexibility that got built into the system that perhaps remains for people to take advantage of now.
Yeah, certainly seems like the only time that people could encounter a sheriff outside the court system in Australia. And may we let the House of Cards continue. Maybe it's for the greater good. Denise Raward, thanks so much for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar podcast. You can read her fascinating article on yourmortgage.com.au. Thanks, Denise.
Thank you.
Thanks, Denise. Cheers.